All right, we are back now here with the second section of Module 3, which is the Bronze and Iron Age. We've really been in the Bronze Age this whole course, really, so we're really specifically taking the time and talking about this a little later than we probably should have, but the Bronze Age really runs from about 1550 to 1200 BC, and it gives you those dates as we continue through this content, of course. During this time period, we have a lot of pivotal events happening, including the formation of Israel, including the Hebrew exodus from Egypt, their conquest of the land, eventually the kingdoms that end up making up Israel. So we're going to be getting into all of that in this as well. We'll also talk about the late Bronze Age trade network, which we've talked about a little bit when we were talking about Ramses, and all of these things that are going on with the Hittites. That's all late Bronze Age as well. And we're going to talk about the Iron Age, which gets us to the Neo-Assyrians, the Neo-Babylonians, which is the new Assyrians, the new Babylonians, obviously. So we'll be back to Mesopotamia one more time as well. So we're going to have a total of, two sections here, and then maybe in the next module we'll get into some of that as well. But let's start with the Hebrew Exodus and Conquest. And you can kind of see a artist reconstruction here of Karnak Temple. And obviously, you got the pyramids back here in the back, which is ridiculous because they're like 100 miles away from each other. But obviously, this artist is taking some liberties with these things, and that's what Hollywood does, right? So, little artistic license, that extends to film also extends to this this picture here. But we're going to talk about the Exodus, and once we get into that, there's going to be a lot of things, kind of that background we have to clean up a little bit that we are misled by our movies, on. But before we get into that, let's talk about Abraham and his descendants, and then we'll get into the Exodus. Now, Abraham is called by God in the end of Genesis chapter 11. His story and his family story will basically be the rest of Genesis, as we know. So Genesis has 50 chapters. The first 11 talk about creation and mankind, the fall of mankind, the rise, and the flood, and all these things happen in 11 chapters. It covers thousands of years. In fact, it's really impossible to tell how long it even covers, but there's not a great way to figure that out either. It's a very difficult part of the Bible to really trace the history when it compares to other sources. But when we get to Abraham, we get a little bit more ability to trace the history, and I think it's really telling that this is part of God's purpose. So here's Abraham and his family. They get 38 chapters, and all the centuries and lineal, times of history before Abraham, we're going to squeeze those into 11. So this is telling us that where the priority is here, right? It's with Abraham. And we get all caught up in creation, we get all caught up in all those details, but what clearly the Bible is trying to prioritize is God's relationship with this particular family. And we move over this, I think it's better for the ability to see God's, see the words and how God establishes this covenant with Abraham, and this covenant will ultimately culminate with the ministry and sacrifice of Christ. And so Christianity in this covenant is essentially, established first off with Abraham. So God calls Abraham from where we talked about the first couple lectures, right? He's living in Ur, and he tells him to go to this new land. And so, which ends up being the promised land, and that's what's now known as Israel. Israel was actually his grandson, Jacob, his alternate name. So don't even, we have pretty precise kind of idea of what's going on here. Now, one of Jacob's son is Joseph, and Joseph becomes famously sold into slavery by his brothers, and he ends up in Egypt. And this is where we really start to talk about, Egypt. And a lot of Egyptologists go, well, there's not a shred of evidence for Joseph ever being in Egypt, and this is basically a dream come true, rags to riches fairy tale, right? So they say it's a myth. They say it's a cute story that's told. It's a legend, right? It's a fable. They say there's no direct evidence of Joseph, so it must not be true. Now, that's not exactly correct, and I'm going to give you some reasons why there's some plausibility to the story, even from a historical standpoint, even if you're not looking at it from a religious viewpoint. So we need to start with something a little bit more philosophical here when it comes to Joseph. And I think we have to look at this in terms of what does it mean that there's no direct evidence of something? Does that mean that that said thing never happened? Or doesn't mean that evidence hasn't survived and that we are at the mercy of the evidence and sources that have survived. And so it's true that there's no direct evidence from Egypt for either Joseph or the sojourn or the Exodus. But to draw conclusions from that is to come to the fallacy of negative proof. Negative proof is not proof. If you have evidence of something, great, we have evidence. If you have no evidence, you can't say it's fictitious necessarily. It just simply means that you don't have good sources on it. And absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, okay? And I think that that's a key saying that you have to repeat. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So I think Joseph is, a historical story. I think that there are elements of it that we can't prove because that's not really how history works. Most of the time we can't prove the details of a conversation in a text until we have a second or third text saying the exact same thing. And even then historians might say, oh, well, it's just a copy, right? So what would constitute proof? Direct proof of things in the ancient world are few and far between. And so what we're really doing here is making a case for plausibility and probability. So likelihood of these events, right? Because direct physical proof isn't something we have. It's not like forensic DNA, evidence from a CSI case or something. That doesn't happen in ancient history. We need to understand what we're working with the sources, and no reason for despair, right? Because if you're a Bible-believing Christian, as we are, we already believe it. And so really, we just have to have I think it's important that we have some good reasons to believe that from a historical standpoint. So it is true, we try and reconcile, but, and this says reconciling biblical accounts, sorry about that. There isn't direct evidence, and it can be difficult, but we are influenced by Hollywood, and our artistic sources and stuff like Joseph and Moses and Exodus have become part of our culture in a way that biblical authors would have never imagined. I mean, the Prince of Egypt, the Exodus movie with, I think Russell Crowe or whoever, the Ten Commandments movie, these things live on in our lives, and they have influence over the viewer, and ultimately, they're not accurate. They're hit or miss at best, okay? There is, again, no direct evidence. I wish I could show you a rock here or something, a picture that says, hey, look, the Israelites were here. You know what else? But even if we had that rock, you know what people would say? Oh, it's a forgery. It's fake. It's a different Moses, right? To some people, there's no amount of proof that can dissuade them. But I can give you a reasonable case here. Again, starts with circumstantial evidence, confirming the details of the Exodus tradition. So you look at Joseph and then you look back at the Exodus, and I'll give you a quick overview. The Joseph story, and then it makes one really key comparative point. So Joseph is sold into slavery. He does exceedingly well for his master, Potiphar. And so Potiphar's house increases. It's doing really well. Then Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him. Joseph resists her. She accuses him of rape, assaulting her and all of this. And essentially, so Joseph gets locked up. He meets the Pharaoh's baker and Pharaoh's butler. They have some dreams. He interprets them. And the dreams that he interprets come true. One dies, one is spared, and gets put back in his previous position. Fast forward a couple of years. Pharaoh's having terrible dreams. His butcher says, hey, wait a minute. I know a guy that can interpret dreams. He got my dream right. So Pharaoh's like, well, go get him. Where's he at? And they said, well, he's in prison. He's locked up, and so they go get him. They bring him before Pharaoh. He correctly translates Pharaoh's dream. Basically, there's going to be 7 great years of harvest, 7 great years of famine. Now, Egypt has always been a place where people can go during famine because they have a surplus of food and grain. They're a little bit more famine-proof, as we've talked, because of the Nile. And Joseph says, hey, there's going to be a doozy of a drought coming up. We need to prepare. And Pharaoh says, hey, that's great. Why don't you just get on that? I'll put you second in charge of the whole land. And here's the part where scholars say, now, come on, that's bull. Because that would never happen. The Egyptians would never put a foreigner in charge of anything. This can't have happened. They don't like foreigners, right? They don't promote them. Except there is a comparison that makes this much more believable. They say there's no way a Semitic person like Joseph would be second in command. Well, actually, we have the tomb of a man named Opera El. And that's a Semitic name. Okay, I'm not going to give you all the technicalities here, but this guy that they found the tomb of was a Semite for sure. He was a Hebrew. He's from the same place Joseph is from. And in his tomb, he talks about how he was made second in command of all of Egypt. Now, I'm not sitting here saying that that's Joseph, that that's Joseph's tomb, right? But, I mean, it could be, I guess. It's probably not. But his tomb does demonstrate that Egyptians would occasionally promote someone who was a foreigner to high office. So you can't say Joseph must be fiction because Egyptians would never do that. Actually, yes, they do, and we have proof of it. And so that's what I mean by circumstantial evidence. It's not direct. It's not Joseph himself, probably. It's someone very much like him, and it demonstrates, again, that there's the ability for this to be believable. The same thing happens with numbers. A number of details with the Exodus tradition. This is really from setting the first Ramses the Great, father at Karnak. He's headed out to battle. He's marching there. He's kind of turned around. He's heading off to battle, and we see him giving a series of forts, okay? And so if we look here, there's a series of forts in this picture that as he's riding out, there are forts being put out. He's establishing forts. And so in the Bible, when the Israelites are leaving Egypt, God specifically says, hey, don't take this route, okay? Don't take this route. So you have these forts that Ramses built all along the Mediterranean. And so when the Israelites are leaving, God tells them, hey, don't go this route that makes the most sense. Go this other way. Why? So you don't have to deal with the Egyptian military over and over and over again. So maybe in God's mercy, he says, hey, I'm going to deal with the Egyptians. I just don't have to do it all these times in a row. So the author of the Bible would have to have that detail perfectly correct, that there were these forts here and that they couldn't really travel that way for this to be true. So as you can see, the line of forts, plain as day. Here you have Pi-Ramses and Pithom is one of the other big ones. If you want to get to the promised land, this is the route you would take. Just go right there. But God says, don't. The Egyptians had the forts, and they've actually done a lot of excavations in this area. And scholars, archaeologists can tell you absolutely that these are absolutely the forts that the Bible is referencing. And so God says, hey, you can't go that way. You have to go all the way around and have this big long journey. And they wander around and they anger God with their sin. And you have all these zigzags that they do through the desert out here in Mount Sinai. And they zigzag back and forth for 40 years. And they finally end up way over here. So Exodus 1 through 20 shows an incredible familiarity with Egypt, first-hand knowledge of Egypt. Which would be really hard to do later on. Where do they get all these Egyptian terms, right? Why do they know all these Egyptian words, like the word for baskets and reeds in the story of Moses' birth? And it's full of Egyptian terms. And that means that these people had first-hand knowledge, and that's kind of circumstantial evidence. They have a knowledge because of the circumstance. Egyptian loan words in the Hebrew text requires a lot of explanation to someone who says it's completely fiction. If there's circumstantial pieces of evidence, what's the circumstance that explains how the Egyptian terms end up there? Well, I think the best answer is maybe a large group of Hebrews spent a really long time in Egypt and then got out. The capital itself, Pi-Ramses. Ramses the Great builds this capital. It was only used for about 120 years. If you go back and look at this picture, you have Pi-Ramses. So it's built here, and there's a branch of the Nile River that ran right beside the old Pi-Ramses capital. Then the Nile shifts, and that part of the river dries up, and that city dies out. it's gone. It goes away. So here's the real question. If it's only there for about 150 years, we know exactly when they built it, we know exactly when they abandoned it, and that city is named specifically in the Bible text, it gives us a pretty good time frame of when the Exodus would have happened. And if they had written this way later, you're talking, if they say, oh, well, this was written 1,000 years later, just to make up for the whole Christian story, right? If they had done that, how would they have known about this city at all? They wouldn't have. They had to have known about it because they were there. So, it's just kind of interesting. Also, in the Exodus, you have to remember the Egyptians never admit defeat. Okay, look at Kadesh. Remember, Ramses goes and he almost gets killed by the Hittites, right? It's a stalemate at best. And then he goes and he's like, I won this great victory. And the Hittite king's like, dude, I smoked you. What are you talking about? But he takes this stalemate and celebrates it on an unprecedented scale. They don't admit defeat. And the other point I want to make is that, it involves some kind of scholarship that this is more like civil sociology kind of thing right here. Slavery is a terrible origin story. It's ridiculous as an origin story. I'm not saying, slavery is bad, but can you imagine a group of people sitting down and saying, okay, let's come up with an account of our past and make it up so that we can tell our children and grandchildren of our glorious past. And we'll just make something up cool. Oh, yeah, here's an idea. We were slaves in Egypt. No, that's absurd. Why would you say you were slaves in Egypt if you weren't? People tell stories of their past. They aggrandize them. They don't make it seem worse. Like, they don't do this kind of stuff unless it actually happened. But again, not saying, slavery was okay, but it does kind of like, if they hadn't been slaves, the story would have made a little less sense too, because why would you make that up? So there's some significant kernels of truth within this story. So if the Exodus happened, then what? We're going to go through this real quick. There's a lot of technical stuff, but Pyramses, as we said, mentioned Exodus 1:11. It was only there for 150 years. That's the basis for what we call the late date. When did it happen? When did the Exodus happen is what we're trying to find out, which is the time of Ramses the Great. Then you have to contrast that to the early date, which is based on 1 Kings 6:1, which says that Solomon built the temple 480 years after the Exodus. And so the thing I go for is the late date. You don't have to believe me. You can go for the earlier date. So that would make if you took that and when they built the temple and then you go back 480 years, whatever. I think it's closer to the Pyramses city date than anything else. Because ancient people did not use numbers literally, okay? You have to understand what they're based on. 480 is the number given in 1 Kings, and that is also 12 times 40. 40 is a very rich symbolic number in the Old Testament. So is 12 tribes of Israel. It means an ideal length of time or a generation. 40 is the length of a generation. So in saying 12 generations after the Exodus, Solomon built the temple, what he means is that a generation is supposed to be how long it takes for children to have children if they die at 40, right? That's life expectancy. That's not when they start having children. That's more like 20 to 25. So if you're looking at males or even younger, or you're looking at females, take that number and multiply it times 12, and instead of 40 times 12, you end up with like 20 times 12, and that's a heck of a lot closer to the Pyramses date, which makes sense because that would really align up with what we know about Pyramses. And so they do this as kind of a symbol code to say that, we built the temple in the perfect amount of time following the Exodus. So Solomon built the temple because when else would you build it? Of course he built it in perfect timing. And it relates back to the Exodus. So if you were to take the 1 Kings verse and say, no, it's definitely a little bit early based on that. I don't know what it's earlier because of that verse. I don't know how you justify the Pi-Ramses name in Exodus 1:11. You know, Scripture agrees with itself. It doesn't. They wouldn't have written the same story two different ways. So I think that the answer to that is more in the idea of understanding the numbers more than anything. So what that brings us to the conquest and settling of land. It's very important because Christians, this is the foundation to the development of Israel and the Israel identity. They're of the Messiah and the Messiah Jesus himself. So this is so-called Israel Stealer that we talked about previously. It mentions Israel as a people, not as a place. It's the first mention of Israel outside the Bible, which is significant because it's putting them right next to a bunch of places right where they should be after they've conquered the land. So it's really nice sort of anchor point for us to say, okay, Israel is definitely in the land of Canaan by this time. So then you say, well, what about Joshua and his conquest there? There should have been evidence, for that. But again, we have to be careful. The first thing we want to do is read any ancient source in context. And that specifically is true about Scripture because the stakes are even higher. Joshua is written using hyperbole, a literary technique where ancient people or modern, but ancient people do this a lot, really exaggerate for effect. They say they'll kill everyone, and they killed off all the Canaanites. Everyone was destroyed. They put every one of them, in chains and killed them all out. And every ancient culture text does this. But we know that it's not literal. It's hyperbole. It means that they want a big battle and decimate their enemies, but they don't literally kill every one of them, which we know because they get in trouble for marrying them. And if they had killed every one of them, they wouldn't have been in trouble for marrying them, and they get into trouble for worshiping their gods. And so we have to understand that it is a literary technique that is kind of used in that sense. It's like when somebody on social media says, "Oh, I had the greatest day ever." Like, really? Did you? Like, you got married and you won the lottery and had your first child all in the same day or whatever? Like, I guess it'd be a bad day if you got married and had your first child in the same day. But what does the greatest day consist of, right? It's safe to say that your friend would be saying that they had a really good day, and that you intuitively, even without thinking about it, realized it was just a good day. They had good things going for them. Even though they said, I had the best day ever. Well, I doubt it, right? It's kind of written in the same sense to that degree. So we have to be careful reading the text of the Bible in some ways. In the Bible, it says that there are only 3 cities that are destroyed: Jericho, Hazor, and Ai. Hazor is clearly destroyed at this time. We know we have clean excavations where you have this, big layer of ash, which means it was destroyed and burned to the ground at the same time of Joshua, right? In that same kind of layer. So you go down like a 7-layer salad or something, you get to the layer of time that would have been Joshua's time period, and boom, you have destroyed Egyptian and Canaanite gods and goddesses, statues of them. That means that the Egyptians and Canaanites didn't do it, because why would they destroy their own statues? But who would? The Israelites. So it seems to fit really well. Unfortunately, because Jericho was such an appealing site for archaeologists, it's a mess. You can't really do much for it. It's been really, really churned up, because once you dig, it's done forever. You can't put it back and then re-dig and have the same context, right? And so you just kind of have to remember that, you have to look at what you can look at. Here we have this origin story that, it's Hebrew, and you understand that that Joshua and the Israelites went up, they attacked, they turned these cities into ruins. We have a lot of evidence of some of this. And so when looking at all of this, you really have to take this into account and see that there is definite plausibility for these stories more than anything else. And that's a major, major step forward, even just looking at it from a historical standpoint and understanding that the Bible is true. It is a history. It is historically accurate, even if it's a little bit over the top or the numbers we don't really understand sometimes. It is a history. And so we'll pick back up with the Bronze and Iron Age in the last section. Thank you.